Where can you see the ecotones? If you go to enough conferences with the Ecological Society of America, you will eventually see a bunch of people hanging outside the conference after all the talks, maybe after the cocktail hours, and there'll be a bunch of people playing music. And invariably someone will say, hey, let's call ourselves the ecotones. So I have been in those little sessions, and yeah, I said last time that I was in a band called the Ecotones. No, that's just kind of a bunch of people getting together, making noise. I have been kicked out of hotel lobbies for that reason also, but that's another story. Okay, but I digress. We were talking about Clements, closed communities, the superorganism, the holistic view, and the interdependence of all those species. So clearly they need each other. And that's going to come back in play in the next chapter, because his view of plant succession, which dominates our view of plant succession, was influenced by this closed community idea that if you push that system off, it will come back to the closed community that you had in place. What do I mean by pushing it off? Fire, all right? If there's a fire, it's going to wipe out that closed community to some degree, and then it's going to come back, okay? And I'll just say here, the problem with that view, in part, is that he didn't accept, at least initially, that a disturbance is part of the system, that fire is part of the system. Now remember, this is back when we put out every single fire. It's a good example of why this doesn't really work. But we put out every single fire because we thought they didn't belong. But in fact, the plants had multitudes of adaptations to deal with fire, and the fire is part of the system. And so that alters how we view communities today. And for instance, there was a hint that this was coming down the pike back in the day with Clements. So look at this community here. There are no boundaries, or are there? How many communities do you see here? And as a hint, I'll tell you that this picture comes out of the Amazon basin, right? Which is a massive ecosystem, biggest on Earth. And these plants are going to show up all over. I mean, there's going to be some separation of where these plants occur, but in any forest, incredibly diverse, no clear boundaries, all right? Except you could go to this particular plot, let's say you do, and you say, you know, I wonder what insects live in this tree right up here. Okay, what kind of insects do we have here? So you fumigate it. Back in the day, you could do that. You could just go and put a big tent, these are tall, fumigate it and collect all the insects. Or in some other fashion, figure out a way to collect all the data on what insects are in here. And you'd find that there's, you know, partitioning of the insects from the canopy down to the ground. But it's a massive community in and of itself. And there is an ecotone, and there are boundaries around this tree. And if you go find another one of the same species somewhere else, let's say here, or even further, you find that it repeats itself. Okay, it's not just a random association on this particular location. There's actually some repetition in what insect communities or birds occur on that little island of habitat. And it's incredibly diverse though. The larger picture that we're used to is that there are no boundaries like that serpentine setting. It's the Amazon basin. And I think our eastern deciduous forests are more analogous to the Amazon basin than they are to Pikes Peak, where Clements was doing his work, and that dry habitat and nasty soils created clear, closed boundaries, closed systems, and ecotones. We sort of lose the ecotones in other locations. For instance, in the eastern deciduous forest. So look at the trees that we have here. You should recognize ash, hemlock, tulip tree, maple, witch hazel, maybe not, maybe, oak, pitch pine. And look how they come and go. So abundance on the y-axis, moisture gradient from moist to dry, or at least less moist. And you can see that some species, like the hemlock, really likes a nice moist habitat, does not do well when the soils dry out, drops off about halfway down this gradient. This one is what? Red maple. It takes over in the mid-moisture gradient area. And then the witch hazel really likes it less dry. The pine, oh, sorry, that's pine, likes it really dry. The witch hazel is over here, mid, and then it drops off when it gets really dry. So ecologists were walking through the eastern deciduous forest, probably reading Clement's work and saying, wait a minute, this doesn't work out here. And there was a guy at Cornell named Whitaker, Robert Whitaker. I've had the good fortune to meet and have conversations with his son, who's about my age, is a very interesting character, loves his fungi as much as I love my fungi, and has made a hobby of taking pictures and drawing, painting them, and has had a great career that way. Anyway, Robert Whitaker, you would know his dad, you would know because he gave us the biomes in large part. He said that you can actually predict what plants might be in a location by the temperature and the moisture of that zone. And you would have deserts, Arctic, eastern deciduous, tropical, based on those two factors, temperature and moisture. He also gave us something else that you know. I think that last one, the biomes, maybe he was working with, or others were coming up with these ideas at the same time. I'm not sure he's the one that sort of sparked the understanding. But what he did spark an understanding of is the 5 kingdom system, right? Now today you guys learn more than just 5 kingdoms, but when I was coming up, well, the first story was there were 3 kingdoms. There was plants, animals, and mineral. I'm not that old, but bizarre. I remember that as a lesson from somebody. I learned the 5 kingdom system, so plants, animals, fungi, Monera, and Protoctista. We see the Monera now splitting into Archaea and eubacteria. We see the Protoctista splitting into all sorts of things. Way more diversity in Protoctista that's actually, I've shown you that tree of life. It's all over the place. If you just go with genetic diversity, there's a lot going on in Protoctista. It's not just 5 kingdoms. But anyway, Whitaker came up with that system, and it worked very well, kind of still does, as long as you don't take it too seriously. The other thing he did is he walked out into these forests, and he started to see that plants are coming and going, seemingly independent. That's very different than Clement's story. Clements was saying, no, they're all interacting together, and Clement's students especially. They work as units, closed communities. Whitaker's walking in the forest out here, and he's saying, I don't think so. And Whitaker isn't that old. He wasn't writing in the 20s and 30s. This other guy was. I'll come to that in just a minute. But when Whitaker starts publishing this, people go back and find Gleason, you'll get the name in a minute, and the individual. They find Gleason's work right around the same time as Clements, and they say, oh wait, he was saying this already back then. Let's dig into that some more. So we can now look at this image that I used earlier. I believe it's in your textbook now, but it may be in an older version of your textbook, so I apologize if it's not. But here we have the closed community Clementsian model that we've already talked about, and then we get the more open community with species coming and going seemingly at will, but they're following an environmental gradient clearly. And it could be moisture, it could be temperature, it could be light, it could be serpentine soils and things like that. There are serpentine soils out here, but they may not mark the sharp boundaries that we see out west. So plants may or not respond to gradients in the same way. They may not even see it. We saw that picture in the slide from the serpentine data to show that some species actually don't even see the ecotone, the serpentine, or the sandstone. They just can live across the board. So that tells you that it's probably a ubiquitous trait. It's just that the boundaries between the gradient sort of changes, they're not as clear in the eastern deciduous forest or in the Amazon basin, and therefore the communities are not as distinct. The top panel shows what we've already talked about with the clemency enclosed community. The bottom panel looks at Whitaker's, or uses Whitaker's ideas about environmental or ecological gradients. Okay, so let's look at this idea, the bottom panel with the open communities, and our next grump, so to speak. Sorry, Gleason. I am Gleasonian. There are people that are Clementsian, and I really think this guy had it right. Clements did too, but he had simplified it a little bit too much to consider it all closed superorganisms, again, his students, etc. Note the plant presses he's got in his hands there. He is a plant ecologist. He was president of the BSA, Botanical Society of America. So was Clements at one time or another as well. So these guys were big giants in the field, and I love that picture with all those plant presses. He wasn't just looking at a single flower and moving on. He was collecting entire communities of flowers in different places or plants. So again, we'll just go through all these in one full swoop. And so here's his name, Henry Gleason, and he says communities are open systems. And he also said something that was pretty different at the time. They were not in equilibrium. They're constantly changing. And in his system, he basically can accept the idea of disturbance and fire. I don't know if he came right out and said it. It's been a long time since I've read his stuff, and my ideas have kind of gotten a little bit calcified with fire especially, but I suspect it would fit right in to say, no, disturbance is part of the system. Hurricanes happen, tree fall happens, etc. His was, this should be highlighted yellowish, whereas Clements was holistic, Gleason had an individualistic view, okay? And it says that species occur together, but that's largely by coincidence. And I'm going to show you, I think, a series of slides that are pretty convincing to say that species are not together because they need each other. They're there by coincidence in a community. And the species are independent of each other as a result. So if you walk into a beech maple forest, beech doesn't need maple. It's just that beech and maple are there. It's almost more Zen, if you will. They are there, therefore they're there. They're not there because they want to be there with their friends, all right? And it's the humans that look at it and go, oh, we've got a whole storyline here. Maple needs beech, and beech needs maple, and they're all part of the same lung system and blah, blah. Be careful with that overinterpretation of what you see. He also said that basically considered communities to be groups of independently interacting species. They're all in it for themselves, right? I say that often. All right, so once again, what is a community? By now, it should be quite clear that I don't have an answer. I have a lot of words to go around. Oh, I love how I spelled there on that last slide. That's awesome. It must be not a typo, but a autocorrect in my computer. Anyway, by now it should be clear that there is no clear answer, that it depends. It's a great professorial answer. What is a community? It depends. It depends on a lot of things, which we'll get into in a little bit. Yet, you have to define your community if you're doing research on plant ecology. You can't just blow this idea off, but you have to look at each community and look at it in its unique way, and then use the information you gather from that to define that particular community to help you understand what questions need to be addressed and how to answer them in that particular community. Certainly there's tons of overlap, but you have to do it. And it really helps to look at space and time, the spatial and temporal conditions of that community, which I'm going to do in the next segment. But for now, let's look at some communities that you may or may not be familiar with. So this is out of Hamilton, an image out of Hamilton College. I suspect you would recognize that as a fairly decent kind of plant forest community in our area. I think there is some maple and hemlock in there, ferns down at the bottom in the understory, and some vaccinium and other things back in there. Lots of mosses. It's a pretty healthy community, really messy. Old growth is very messy. Although there's a lot of skinny little stems also, there's some big trees, and more importantly for old growth, there's coarse woody debris. You've got these old trees that have fallen, created gaps with light, which allows things to get established in those zones. It looks like there's a lot of light back in here, so that might be where the clear cut's happening or the market is being installed. They take out those trees to create a gap. Okay, so that's eastern deciduous or mixed conifer system. Here on the west coast is a redwood forest. We would have Gaultheria, we would have vaccinium, we would have ferns again, sword ferns and things like that. Probably some Douglas fir in here. I don't see, maybe over here this is Douglas fir, but huge trees. I don't know if you get the perception here, but those trees are ending pretty soon after this. You know, they're up there, but they're not that high. You walk out in these forests and you are amazed at how tall those trees are. On the coast, they are taller than the redwoods in the Sierra Nevada. It's a different species. The redwoods in the Sierra Nevada are girth. They're big and fat, not so tall. Here is a picture from Steve Sillett, his lab, I suppose, published in National Geographic. He is a professor at my alma mater at Humboldt State University, and his gig is to climb up these redwoods to the canopy and try to figure out what makes them tick. For instance, these trees are so tall, they've reached the limit of growth. Why? Because in order to move water from the soil up to the canopy, you have to have a whole lot of hydraulic pull in the transpiration system, and people are trying to figure out how they can do it at all up there. Just pull, pull, pull. And I should say Douglas fir rivals some of these huge redwoods on the coast. But these guys are nuts. Am I wrong? Okay, whatever. It'd be fun once. Here's another community, and you have to define things very differently. Those coastal redwoods, or the Sierra Nevada redwoods, are ancient forests, 2,000-3,000 years old. Ancient bristlecone pine forest, 2, 3, or even 6,000 years old. These things are really old. They've had a few Yahoo graduate students say, hey, can we cut that particular individual, not this one, but cut that individual down and count the rings? And the National Park Service and others have to say, well, no, we'd like them to continue to live despite our curiosity. They've tried to do coring into the wood, count the rings that way, but the cores break. The wood is really kind of nasty for that kind of activity. But they have enough evidence where they can do some tree counting and tree ring counting and put pieces together and realize that these things are ancient. Is that a healthy forest to you? This is in the White Mountains, which is across the Owens Valley from the Sierra Nevada. So you could stand here and potentially see Mount Whitney across the valley, 14,000 feet. Okay, but here you're at 14,000 feet. Also, the White Mountains is just more desert because of the rain shadow created by the Sierra Nevada, and that's where the bristlecone pines are. Great place to go if you ever get a chance. It's not what you expect if you're looking for a redwood forest, so to speak. Okay, so those are a couple of examples of plant communities, and we're next going to go into what brings these species together and why am I so adamant about the idea that they don't necessarily come together because they need each other. They're basically moving across the landscape over time in their own ways, and occasionally, coincidentally, they're in the same place at the same time, and that's when Clements walks through, or Gleason, or you. You walk into your camp up in the Adirondacks, and you say, yeah, these trees have been here forever, except that they were logged 2 or 3 times. So they are definitely in flux. You just don't feel it at the human scale. So Clements was sort of influenced by that human scale idea, maybe Gleason less so. So there's my prompt here at the end. Are communities always the same? The answer is no, they're constantly shifting. I made this point early on in these lectures when we go from the idea of stasis and stability and balance of nature. It helps not to get trapped into those ideas. You might actually perceive that the climate is warming if you're not stuck with just looking at the weather today. All right? So, okay, we'll see you next time, and we'll dig into this yet again, now looking at how species shift across the landscape, which leads to my idea about individualistic behavior of those species. Okay, good, see you next time.